We're here at the University of York to do a DARGchive interview with Professor Richard Ogden from the Department of Language and Linguistic Science. Richard, thank you very much for agreeing to do a DARGchive interview.
Great pleasure, thank you.
So the first question that we usually ask in these interviews is, how did you get interested in conversation analysis?
That's got quite a long story behind it, is that all right?
Oh, that's great, actually.
So I first came to York in 1990 and I worked with John Local, and my PhD supervisor was John Kelly, and I was a phonetician, and I was working for about 5 years on a speech synthesis project that John Local had with John Coleman. And then I joined the staff of the department in the mid-90s after my supervisor John Kelly retired, and both of them were really interested in phonetic detail. And I think from them I learnt about the value of being a bit obsessive about details within speech. But I had, I guess, got my linguistics training in a very conventional linguistics background at Cambridge, and I wanted to move away from the kinds of material that linguists usually work on, which is scripted material that's recorded in labs and so forth. And then around the late 90s, a few things happened sort of simultaneously. One was that Marja-Leena Sorenen came on a visit from Helsinki to sociology, and she gave a talk about her work in our department. Paul Drew organised that. So that was one thing that happened, and then I got research leave and decided I would like to go to spend some time in Helsinki because my PhD thesis was on Finnish, and I wanted to work on some small details in Finnish phonetics and phonology which would be quite difficult to collect. But I thought, conversation would be a good place to find these items. So I wrote to Marja-Leena and I said, do you think I could spend a couple of months in Helsinki? And she said, sure, and she organised everything to make that happen. And I think just before I went, around that time or just after, I can't remember when exactly, but I had another trip to Helsinki where Betty Krupa-Kulin and Margaret Selting were talking about the phonetic construction of lists, and I thought, now I understand what this is about, because I had read some of John's work, but I hadn't quite really understood about the CA stuff properly. So I think that was around 1999, 2000, something like that. That's when I had a kind of conversion moment. And from then on, pretty much all the material I've ever worked on has been conversational material. So for me, conversation analysis was a way of getting to look at the sorts of data that linguistics wasn't really looking at, and to see the order and organisation behind it, where conventional linguistics was telling us that, it's messy, it's random, and you can't predict, and da-da-da. So CA really opened the window on seeing how you could compare things, which is a very fundamental linguistic problem. How do you know what things are comparable and what things are alike, and what things are different, and what things should you not put together, and what things could you put together? So. All
right. So you already mentioned your PhD, which you've done here at the University of York. Mm-hmm. Could you talk a little bit about the topic of your PhD, how you got interested in it?
Oh, well, that was actually almost nothing to do with conversation. We have at York an archive of material from London from roughly the 30s to around the 60s. And there was a theory of linguistics generally, but phonetics and phonology in particular, called prosodic analysis. And it's not a very accessible theory, and a lot of the interesting stuff is either published in really difficult to find places or on languages that are not so familiar, or not published. There's a lot of it not published. And John Kelly had collected an archive of this material, so my PhD project was based around unpacking some of the theoretical ideas behind that, and I focused, the data for the thesis came from Finnish. It was a lot of it was kind of ordinary, what would you say, word list kind of data, but then I took some of the theory and applied it to what phoneticians call connected speech, which basically means people saying words in normal sentences rather than in isolation. It wasn't conversational data, but one of the interests is about how you join things together. How do you put words together? And out of that grew my interest in the stuff that took me to Finland in 2000.
All right. So can you talk a little bit about what it was like to do a PhD here at the University of York?
Oh.
At that time?
There were not very many PhD students in linguistics at the time. I think I was one of only 2 or 3, and I wasn't a standard PhD student either because I was doing a funded job. So my PhD was kind of part-time and as a staff member. My main work was actually on the speech synthesis project, so I did the two things in parallel. So it was a strange experience in some ways because I didn't really have a cohort of other PhD students around me, and I was often squeezing the PhD work in between the work that I basically got my salary for. And to be honest, most of the work on the PhD was done my contract ended on the synthesis grant, and the department supported me for a year, and so that helped me just to get the PhD finished, and that's when nearly everything, not everything, but nearly everything got written in that last year. That moment of like, what's going in this thesis? And I remember how I solved it actually. I just wrote pieces of paper with everything that I thought was going in the thesis, and I took a study period in Helsinki for a few weeks and just laid it all out on a table in a library. And then I realised, actually I do have a PhD here, and then I started to move them around, see what the order of the chapters would be and what the gaps were. So yeah, it was a bit of a nail-biting finish.
Wow, yeah, so puzzling things together that were already there. I guess everybody goes through that at some point. It's a PhD.
You have to have the pieces fall together in the right place at the right time.
Yeah, or it's back to the drawing board.
Yeah.
So you already mentioned this in the beginning, but I want to go back to kind of asking you about when you started being interested in conversation analysis and you started understanding what it was about, and you were meeting other people who are conversation analysts. I wonder whether if you look back at those moments, there were sort of particular events, whether it was a paper that you read or a conference talk that you saw, that really became memorable moments for you in terms of what then you went on to do in conversation analysis.
I think probably the thing that helped me more than anything was the 3 or 4 months I spent in Helsinki in 2000, because I had a lot of time to myself. I had data to collect and work on, and that's just a lovely thing, isn't it, to sit down and have data to work on. There were regular data sessions and people were really eager to see what I was doing, and they were kind of surprised that a Brit basically could come to Finland and work on Finnish. So I think I learnt an awful lot. Those people in Helsinki were enormously generous with their time and enthusiasm, encouragement. Just, you know, people like Marja-Leena, Auli Hakulinen, lots of others, and that was just a fantastic experience. And not long after that, there was a conference that was organised. I don't remember exactly who organised it now. Betty Cooper-Cullen was one of them, and I think Margaret Salting was another, and Bill Wells from Sheffield had an involvement in it. But a lot of people came from all over Europe. It got European funding, and the idea was to bring together. So it was kind of the launching event of interactional linguistics, and there were a lot of people there who had backgrounds similar to me, many of them from the Nordic countries in particular, and then a smaller number of people from outside Europe, and a couple of invited speakers. So Manny Shegloff was one of them, and Barbara Fox was there, I remember, and quite a few others. That was a superb conference. I mean, it was just so interesting and exciting because there was the sense of doing something really new and innovative and different, and for the first time. And I think many of the people that were at that conference kind of started their careers at about that time, you know, so it was a really, really effective thing. So those would be my favourite things, I would say, the things that had the biggest effect on me. And then I went a little bit later to a summer school at UCLA with Manny Shegloff and Jean Lerner, and I think there were about 15 of us in our cohort. Liz Stokoe was in the same cohort as me as well, and quite a few other people who are still around. That was hard work, but that was also a really great experience.
Did you enjoy it?
It was hard work, it was a great experience. It was not the easiest week of my life, I have to say. It was quite difficult. I think part of the difficulty of the week was that it was a very interdisciplinary week. There were people from very, very different backgrounds, and that is actually one of the joys of working in CA, that you are constantly meeting up with people who just don't have the same background as you, and the common language that you have is CA. And even then, you know, we might look at the same data but have very, very different perspectives on it, just from the sorts of questions that we're interested in, or what our particular skills are, or what our interests are. And I remember though, that week, the difficulties in that week were really about the frictions between different ways of thinking and looking and working. And yeah, as well as having to work extremely hard. I mean, that was a very non-stop session.
Wow. All right. So I was wondering whether you might have a favorite CA paper or a favorite CA author that you often go to and enjoy reading, or...
Oh.
It doesn't have to be just one.
That is a very difficult question. There's quite a few I could pick out, but I think, and I'm not very good at favourites, I have to say, I'm not very good at favourites. I'm better at thinking about what are the things that I've drawn from or been inspired by, and so I'll just tell you one. It's not a paper as such, it's a chapter by Shegloff. It's in the Interaction and Grammar book, where he talks through, actually, is it in there or is it in the Prosodic conversation? It's a very long paper, and he talks through the structure of turns at talk, and he talks through about the potential at each point, and he makes you think very systematically about beginnings and middles and endings, and he he goes through more, not quite syllable by syllable, but not far off. And that's his style, isn't it? His style is you find something and then you unpick it and you untangle it. And it's a very difficult paper to read because it's very, very dense. And there's an awful lot of stuff in there. It's a very programmatic paper, especially for a linguist. It's very difficult also because he's talking about things that to us as linguists are very familiar items, but he's talking about them in ways that are not familiar. So if you come to that as a linguist, it's a really tough paper to kind of get your head around and to see quite where he's going with it. But it's a paper that really, really helped me understand notions like progressivity through the tone and the relevance of linguistic construction of terms of talk and what some of the possibilities and options would be. And it brings up a lot of very interesting parallels once you get into that mindset of ideas that we have in linguistics about systems of contrast and what the structures are that those bigger systems operate in and how those structures constrain what the systems are. So it's a very grammatical paper in that sense, and a hugely linguistic paper. He doesn't write it in those terms, but the parallels are so striking and so obvious. So I think if I ever were to lose inspiration for for things to do, that's one paper I would definitely go to because it's so immensely rich.
So my next question concerns your research, which is at the kind of intersection between phonetics and conversation analysis. I was wondering how you see this relationship between the two of them.
Oh, that's such an interesting question. And it's an interesting question because I have to wear different sorts of hats. So when I'm amongst conversation analysts, I feel like a phonetician, and when I'm with phoneticians, I feel like a conversation analyst. So it's a very interesting kind of position to be in. So the reason for combining CA with phonetics, there's lots of reasons for doing it, but my reason, the thing that interests me is conventional linguistics and phonology particularly really have very little to say about many of the details that we hear in talk. And there's a lot of things that are ascribed to individual variation and idiosyncrasies. That's one way of accounting for many phenomena. Another way of accounting for them is a very sort of identity-driven approach, which you find in sociolinguistics a lot. And a lot of that is very conventional as well, like age, gender, place of origin, and so on. What CA gives us is a very different sort of take on lots of these things. It gives us a take that actually has time built into it, this idea that we're talking in time and talk unfolds in time, and while we're speaking we have to deal with the demands of things that are happening around us. That's a really interesting concept for linguists because linguistic structures and theories, they kind of take time away. There's no time in an abstract representation of a sentence or a word. They're just abstract units. So that's a very kind of intriguing thing to think about. And I think something that's really great at the moment with the growth in interest in multimodality in CA is that in parallel tracks in phonetics there's more and more an understanding that there's more to speech than just the noises we produce. There's all the physical coordination that has to go on at the same time. I think that CA has a lot to offer there because it has a lot to tell us about what people are doing with these actions but also giving us a structure for thinking about how terms are organised internally and with respect to one another. And if we then map that onto levels of linguistic organisation, like prosodic organisation, the chunking of speech into units and phrases and so forth, there's lots of ways in which those things are made hearable through things like stress and speed and loudness and voice quality and all those things, but also through the way we move our bodies in time with that. So there's an awful lot of very, very interesting things to see and to say about how speech and other activities are connected. And what's missing from huge amounts of linguistics is an interactional understanding. And I think that's one of the things that we really need to get across, sort of literally, to transfer from interactionally oriented work, CA, into linguistics. There still is not enough of an understanding of the fact that a lot of the forms that we see in speech are actually driven through interaction. So the stuff I've been working on is typically stuff that you only will see in interaction and that you can only account for interactionally, because it's sort of a child of interaction.
Yeah. So now that you've mentioned, could you talk a little bit about the projects that you've been working on? So.
Well, the last few years, my main interest has been in click sounds, and as soon as I say click sounds, I produce a click, obviously. So I've been collecting clicks for quite a long time and looking at various kinds, and I've just finished writing a paper on clicks that have to be deliberate, so the sorts of clicks that stand alone or where there's many of them all together. Many of them have got facial expressions as well, so there's things like and these sorts of phenomena. They tie in remarkably well with earlier work I did, which was looking at things like rhythmicity and tempo and timing that comes up so much in the material I've worked at. And clicks are a really good phenomenon in that sense, because they're just sharp little sounds, so it's very easy to locate where they occur in time, and that's what's missing when it comes to looking at the rhythm of language. Because when we think of the rhythm of everyday speech, really we've just got consonants and vowels, and figuring out where the rhythmical beats fall is actually not trivial. It's really difficult. There's a huge literature on that. So that's one of the things that's interesting. But of course, you also have the facial stuff and the bodily behaviours that go around with clicks. So that's also been a very rich thing. And at the moment I've been working with Lelo Kevalik in Linköping in Sweden. We're working on a special issue of Rolsey, looking at non-lexical sounds like these. So we've got lots of interesting things coming up in there. Other types of sound which occur in speech but are not speech. So there's very interesting questions about how do we coordinate speaking with not speaking, and what's the work that the not speaking does, and how do we know what participants themselves make of these noises? What's their orientation to them? How do they treat them? How do they sometimes recycle them or incorporate them into their own next turns at talk? These are really interesting questions, and they're interesting because they're things that are really on the margins of language. They're not in language in some formal sense, but they occur within it. Then they're not of it, but they're in it. That's maybe the best way to say it. And I think understanding these things with my linguist hat on it helps us to think about what are the boundaries of language, and how do we, as ordinary interactants who know at least one language, how do we make sense of these things which we might never have seen or heard before? What are the practices available to us, and how similar are those methods for understanding what we see and hear? How similar are those for language versus non-language? I think it's quite provocative for linguistics to think about these edges, these margins. So, and of course it goes back to the thing I started off with, which is how the details of everyday talk, and how do we make sense of them? What are they like? Why are they this way and not some other way? So I think this click stuff and all the non-lexical stuff all has that as a sort of motivating thing behind it. How do we make sense of these details?
Mm-hmm. Sounds like a fascinating topic, and I look forward to the special issue coming out really soon.
It's going to be good. I'm looking forward to it too.
Cool. So another thing that you're involved in at the moment, you're the director of the Center for Advanced Studies in Language and Communication here at the University of York.
Mm.
Could you talk a little bit about the activities that occur in the framework of the center?
Mm. So the centre was set up quite a long time ago by Paul Drew and John Local as a way to bring together researchers within the university who are working on conversation analysis, and it's got a slightly wider remit than CA, but CA is what is and has been at the heart of it. In reality, that means that most of our members are from Language and Linguistic Science and Sociology, but we have had members also from psychology and education, health sciences, and various other places as well. We meet twice a term, and what we do has varied quite a lot, but we often have data sessions, or we invite people to come from outside and bring data. Sometimes they've brought along with them just very exploratory stuff, and it's been really great fun to sit down and work through things that haven't really had an airing before. We also supervise PhD students jointly between linguistics and sociology, so quite a few of us are involved in joint PhD supervision, and that's sort of facilitated through the existence of CASLC. It just makes it easier for us to do things together, and it provides a good forum for the whole community, including all our PhD students, to come and do things together. And it's a way for us to show what CA stuff we do at York. And we also are organising a number of short courses, which of course they're based around CA, but they have quite a strong linguistic flavour to them in some cases, and a medical interaction flavour in others. So yeah, we're not a big centre, but I think we're fairly lively for the size.
Sounds lovely.
Actually, when I say we're not a big centre, we're still one of the biggest groups doing CA in the country. So
yeah. So you mentioned just before the interview that you're not teaching at the moment, but you have been teaching quite a bit. So I was wondering whether you would be able to share any insights from teaching CA and phonetics and linguistics, and or supervising PhD students.
I actually haven't taught CA as such.
Oh, okay.
I have taught a course called Phonetics of Talk and Interaction, where I do teach some kind of basic concepts from CA, but the idea is to help students but they usually have done some CA in another form before they come onto my module. But the idea has been to give them some experience of working, doing the kinds of things I do in my research. So we take some phonetics and we take some CA and we put them together. And we've worked on lots of different phenomena, and it's often been a really good way to collect new data. So we've worked on lists, on clicks, on increments. That was a long time ago, but the increments one was a very rich project. So that's the way that has been driven. It's been driven by having a kind of problem to solve and getting students to collect data and then giving them some input through lectures and talks and some practical stuff through working in a classroom, usually doing some acoustic analysis or something, and then also some data session experience of, everybody chipping in and providing an insight into some piece of data and then writing it up and working out a collection and writing it up and that kind of thing. So I think the project-based element has been really strong and valuable. And I would say if you want to do something like that, it's a really good way to do it because it makes it easier for students who've got different backgrounds. You can put them together to work and collaborate with each other, which is a real skill actually. It's a difficult thing for us all to learn, but it's an invaluable skill after graduation. Yes, what else could I say?
So then my final question now is kind of stepping away from academia. I was wondering if you had any time and you'd like to share some of the hobbies or favorite pastime activities that you do.
Oh. Well, I was a beekeeper.
Wow.
Was because I developed an allergy
That's no good.
bee stings. So I had a few really happy years of looking after bees, but now I just I supervise someone else looking after them because I can't risk getting stuck.
What is it like to look after bees, if I may ask?
Oh, it's fascinating. It's so interesting because they're it's quite a cerebral activity, just watching insects at work and figuring out what they're doing and how they're behaving and what they're up to and trying to anticipate what's going to happen next and thinking about what you need to do to take care of them and then how you're going to get a nice honey crop and how do you keep them alive is another, all these sorts of issues. It's just great. And picking up a frame of bees which has got there'll be maybe some honey and pollen and larvae and all sorts of things on this one frame and it will be covered with bees and you can feel them all sort of vibrating. That you feel the frame vibrating in your hand with all the bees on it. It's an amazing sensation and usually they're very gentle and placid. I would say almost curious. They're really interesting. But I guess the thing I really do, the thing I really like doing most is I like swimming. So I swim a lot and then my holidays, the reason I swim is that in my holidays I go to Greece and just spend a week doing long distance swims in small groups, so like 5-6 kilometers a day. Usually along coasts if the weather's good between islands, and that's just a fantastic feeling, crossing from one island to another. I absolutely love that. That's what keeps me sane.
Sounds like a lot of fun.
It really is, and you meet nice people doing it as well. Yeah.
That's really
very meditative and contemplative, beautiful activity.
That's great. Thank you very much for a lovely interview.
Pleasure.